Hey guys, settle here. Tonight we're exploring medieval psychology. The ancient science of confidently guessing what's wrong with you. And then bleeding about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. From around the world. In medieval psychology, sadness was not an emotion. It was not grief. It was not stress. It was not the perfectly reasonable reaction to living in a damp hut while everyone you know slowly died of preventable causes. No. Sadness was a fluid problem. Specifically, it was black bile. A cold, dry, mysterious substance that medieval scholars imagined sloshing around inside you like emotional tar. If you felt gloomy, it wasn't because life was hard. It was because your internal plumbing had failed. According to medieval theory, black bile caused melancholy, despair, brooding, and what doctors politely described as excessive thought. Thinking too much, by the way, was a medical red flag. Medieval psychology looked at introspection and said, absolutely not. That's how bile accumulates. The diagnosis was simple. Are you sad? Then congratulations. You are full of bile. The treatment was even simpler. Remove the bile. How? Bloodletting. Vomiting. Laxatives. Sweating. Starving. Occasionally all of them. In one exciting afternoon. Medieval medicine responded to emotional exhaustion by saying, what if we also make you physically miserable? And see which one wins. Doctors took this very seriously. They watched how often you sighed. They tracked your sleep. They analyzed whether you stared into the distance too thoughtfully. A person who quietly reflected was considered more dangerous than someone loudly screaming. Because silence meant the bile was settling. And grief was taking root. Grief, by the way, was treated the same way. If your spouse died, medieval psychology didn't recommend comfort, or community, or time. It recommended a bowl, a blade, and a firm belief that emotions should be drained like spoiled wine. Creative people were especially doomed. Poets, artists, scholars, anyone who enjoyed thinking. They were considered prime candidates for melancholy. Creativity was tolerated only in small doses. Too much imagination caused bile buildup, which caused sadness, which caused treatment, which often caused death. A very efficient system. And here's the best part. If you survived the treatment, the doctor declared success. If you didn't, the problem was technically resolved. Either way, medieval psychology congratulated itself. In an odd way. Turning sadness into a substance made it feel controllable. You couldn't understand your emotions, but you could extract them. You couldn't heal your mind, but you could weaken your body until you stopped complaining. Unfortunately, sadness is not a liquid. Black bile does not exist. And bleeding someone does not cure despair. But medieval psychology didn't know that. And it was extremely confident. Anyway, after medieval psychology decided sadness was a liquid problem, it made another bold discovery. Thinking is risky behavior. Not dangerous in a philosophical sense. Not in a, you might discover something unsettling, kind of way. Dangerous in a, your brain might overheat and ruin your life kind of way. reflection, analysis, prolonged thought. All considered health hazards. According to medieval scholars, the brain was delicate, soft, moist, extremely sensitive to heat. If you thought too much, you generated excess heat. That heat dried the brain. A dried brain led to madness. And madness naturally led to consequences that involved chains. So medieval psychology advised moderation in all intellectual activity. You were encouraged to think just enough to do your job, say your prayers, and not ask follow-up questions. Curiosity was tolerated briefly, then monitored closely. Scholars warned that excessive study, reading late at night, or concentrating too intensely, could cause mental collapse. Imagine being told that learning Latin was medically risky. Medieval psychology essentially looked at education and said, "Careful, that's how it starts." Students were advised to take breaks from thinking. Long breaks. Ideally permanent ones. Overexerting the mind was believed to drain vital spirits, disturb the humors, and invite melancholy. In other words, thinking too hard made your bile angry again. Everything always came back to bile. The truly unfortunate were philosophers. Medieval society admired philosophers in theory, but distrusted them in practice. A philosopher who asked too many questions wasn't seen as insightful. He was seen as someone courting insanity. If you stared into space too often, people assumed your brain was overheating and quietly rearranging itself. And then there were women. Medieval psychology believed women were especially vulnerable to thinking-related disorders, because their brains were supposedly colder, wetter, and more emotionally reactive. This meant that serious intellectual thought was considered not just inappropriate, but medically irresponsible. Education for women wasn't discouraged because of ideology alone. It was discouraged for their own health. Even dreams were suspicious. Vivid dreams meant the imagination was running unchecked, which implied mental imbalance. If you dreamed too creatively, it meant your mind hadn't shut down properly. Sleep was supposed to be passive. If it wasn't, something was wrong. The safest mental state, according to medieval psychology, was mild awareness paired with obedience. A calm mind was not a curious mind. It was a quiet one. A mind that did not wander too far. A mind that did not ask too many questions. A mind that did not look at the world and wonder why it worked the way it did. Because wondering led to thinking. And thinking led to problems. Not philosophical problems. Not existential questions about meaning or purpose. Physical problems. Problems inside the body. According to medieval scholars, the human body was not designed for prolonged thought. It was designed for balance. A careful, fragile balance between heat and cold. Between dryness and moisture. Between the four humors that quietly dictated your entire existence. And thinking disrupted that balance. Too much thought generated heat. Too much heat dried the brain. A dry brain lost its stability. And once stability was gone, everything else followed. Judgment faded. Emotions became unpredictable. Behavior became unusual. And unusual behavior, in medieval society, was rarely tolerated. It was corrected. Sometimes gently. Often not. A person who spent too much time alone with their thoughts was not seen as reflective. They were seen as unstable. A person who asked too many questions was not curious. They were seen as drifting toward madness. And a person who seemed distant, quiet, or introspective was not deep. They were becoming a problem. So the solution was simple. Limit thought. Keep the mind occupied, but not engaged. Active, but not intense. Focused, but only on what was necessary. Work. Routine. Repetition. These were considered safe. They kept the mind moving without letting it wander. Because wandering was dangerous. A wandering mind could start to notice things. Patterns. Contradictions. Details that did not quite make sense. And once you started noticing things, you might start questioning them. And once you started questioning things, you were already moving beyond what medieval physiology considered safe. So instead of encouraging understanding, the system encouraged stability. Not truth. Not insight. Just stability. A steady emotional state. A predictable routine. A life that did not shift too far in any direction. Because extremes were dangerous. Too much happiness could be just as suspicious as too much sadness. Too much energy suggested imbalance. Too much stillness suggested internal disturbance. Everything had to be moderated. Carefully. Constantly. Even food was part of this system. Food was not just nourishment. It was medicine. Every ingredient had qualities. Hot or cold. Dry or moist. And eating the wrong combination could disrupt your internal balance without warning. A meal was not chosen based on taste. It was chosen based on what your body was believed to need. If you were too cold, you needed warmth. If you were too dry, you needed moisture. If your humors were out of balance, your entire diet might change. And if diet failed, stronger methods followed. Treatments that forced the body back into alignment. Not by understanding it, but by correcting it. Bloodletting was one of the most common. The idea was simple. If something inside you was wrong, remove part of what was inside you. Reduce the excess. Restore the balance. It did not matter if the problem could not be seen. It was assumed to be there. And removing blood made it feel like something was being done. Which, in many cases, was enough. Because medieval physiology was not built on evidence. It was built on certainty. A certainty that the body followed rules. A certainty that those rules were understood. And a certainty that any deviation could be corrected with the right intervention. Even if that intervention made things worse. Even if it solved nothing. Even if the person did not survive it. The system remained intact. Because the system did not measure success the way we do now. It did not ask whether the patient recovered. It asked whether the theory remained consistent. And it always did. Because every outcome could be explained. If the patient improved, the treatment worked. If the patient did not improve, the imbalance was too severe. If the patient died, the problem was beyond correction. At no point did the system consider that the explanation itself might be wrong. That possibility simply did not exist. And without that possibility, there was nothing to challenge. Nothing to question. Nothing to rethink. Only more observations. More interpretations. More confidence. Over time, this created a world where the body was not something you understood. It was something you managed. Carefully. Constantly. Always aware that something inside you might be slightly off. Something unseen. Something subtle. Something waiting to become a problem. And because the explanation was always internal, the responsibility was always yours. If you felt tired, something was wrong inside you. If you felt sad, something was wrong inside you. If you felt confused, distracted, or overwhelmed, something was wrong inside you. The world itself was rarely questioned. The conditions people lived in were rarely blamed. The focus remained on the body. On the fluids. On the balance. On the idea that everything you experienced could be traced back to something physical, measurable, and correctable. Even when it was not. And in a strange way, that belief made life feel more predictable. Because if everything had a cause, then everything had a solution. Even if the solution was unpleasant. Even if it did not work. It still existed. And that was enough. For a while. Until the patterns started to shift. Until people began to notice that the treatments did not always help. That the explanations did not always fit. That the body might be more complicated than a container of fluids. But that realization came slowly. Quietly. Over generations. Because systems built on certainty do not collapse quickly. They persist. They adapt. They explain themselves again and again until the explanation becomes part of everyday life. And medieval physiology did exactly that. It became normal. Not because it was correct. But because it was familiar. It became normal. Not because it was correct. But because it was familiar. Familiar ideas have a way of settling in quietly. They stop feeling like theories. They start feeling like facts. And once something feels like a fact, it no longer needs to be questioned. It simply exists. Like the assumption that your body is always slightly out of balance. Like the idea that your thoughts can harm you. Like the belief that discomfort must come from somewhere inside you. These ideas did not need proof. They needed repetition. And medieval life provided plenty of that. Every illness reinforced the system. Every strange behavior confirmed it. Every unexplained feeling became another example of imbalance. And because people did not have another framework to compare it to, this one remained unchallenged. Not because it was perfect, but because it was available. Now, one of the more interesting consequences of this way of thinking was how people learned to interpret themselves. You did not just feel something. You analyzed it. Quietly. Constantly. If you woke up feeling different, you noticed. If your mood shifted, you considered why. If your body felt heavier, lighter, warmer, colder, slower, faster. You tried to place it somewhere within the system. Everything became a signal. A clue. A small piece of information about what might be happening beneath the surface. And over time, this created a kind of internal awareness. That was both careful and slightly anxious. Because if everything means something, then nothing is neutral. A headache is not just a headache. It is imbalance. Fatigue is not just fatigue. It is imbalance. A moment of sadness is not just a moment. It is the beginning of something that needs correction. And once you start thinking this way, it becomes difficult to stop. Because every feeling invites interpretation. And every interpretation leads back to the same place. The humors. Always the humors. Blood. Yellow bile. Black bile. Phlegm. For simple explanations for a very complicated system. And simplicity, even when it is wrong, can be very convincing. Especially when it offers control. Because if your body is governed by rules, then those rules can be followed. If those rules can be followed, then problems can be prevented. Or at least that is what it felt like. So people adjusted their lives. They ate carefully. They rested carefully. They avoided extremes. They paid attention to the seasons. Because the outside world, according to medieval physiology, directly influenced the inside one. Winter was cold and dry. Summer was hot and dry. Spring was warm and moist. Autumn was cold and moist. Each season shifted the balance of the body. Each change in weather required adjustment. Different foods. Different routines. Different precautions. Life became a constant process of alignment. trying to stay in harmony with a system that was never entirely stable. And when something went wrong, when the balance slipped, when the body no longer behaved as expected, there was always a reason. Even if that reason was invisible. Even if it had to be imagined. Now, this way of thinking also shaped how people viewed each other. Because if personality itself was tied to bodily fluids, then behavior was not just personal. It was physical. A quick temper was not just a personality trait. It was too much yellow bile. A quiet, withdrawn nature was not just temperament. It was too much black bile. A slow, calm demeanor was not just preference. It was phlegm. And someone energetic, social, and lively was simply full of blood. People were not just themselves. They were compositions. Mixtures. Balances that could shift at any time. And this made identity feel less fixed. Less stable. Because if your personality depends on your internal balance, then who you are can change. Not gradually, but suddenly. A slight shift in your humors, and you might become someone else entirely. Someone sadder. Someone angrier. Someone quieter. Someone harder to recognize. And again, the solution was not understanding. It was correction. Bring the balance back. Restore the proper mixture. Return the body to its expected state. And everything else would follow. At least, that was the idea. But reality was less predictable. Because people did not always return to balance. Treatments did not always work. And sometimes, the more the system tried to correct something, the worse it became. But even then, the belief remained. Because belief is not easily undone. Especially when it is reinforced by authority. Doctors, scholars, and educated figures. All supported the same framework. They wrote about it. They taught it. They passed it on. And when knowledge is shared like that, it becomes more than an idea. It becomes a structure. Something that holds everything else in place. And medieval physiology was exactly that. A structure. A way of organizing the world. A way of explaining the body. Even when the explanation did not quite fit. And perhaps most importantly, a way of reducing uncertainty. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Not knowing why you feel the way you feel is difficult. It leaves space for doubt. For fear. For questions without answers. But a system like this removes that space. It fills it. Completely. With explanations that may not be correct. But are always available. And sometimes, availability is enough. Even if it comes at a cost. Even if that cost is accuracy. Even if that cost is the body itself. Even if that cost is the body itself. Because in the end, the body was always the focus. Not the environment. Not the circumstances. Not the quiet, persistent difficulties of everyday life. The body. Something contained. Something measurable. Something that could be adjusted. Or at least, something that felt like it could be adjusted. And that distinction mattered. Because feeling in control is often more comforting than actually being in control. Medieval physiology offered that comfort. A structured explanation. A clear cause. A direct response. Even when the response did not solve the problem. It created the sense that something was being done. And doing something has always been easier than sitting with uncertainty. Now, one of the quieter effects of this system was how it shaped patience. Or rather, how little patience it allowed. Because if every imbalance had a solution, then every imbalance required action. There was no reason to wait. No reason to observe for too long. No reason to allow things to pass on their own. Intervention came quickly. Sometimes immediately. A feeling appeared. And the response followed. Not slowly. Not cautiously. But with confidence. And confidence, in this case, often replaced caution entirely. Because hesitation suggested doubt. And doubt did not fit well within a system that already had answers. So instead of asking whether something needed to be done, the question became how much should be done. How much blood should be removed. How much food should be restricted. How strongly the body should be corrected. And correction, more often than not, was not gentle. It was decisive. Direct. Sometimes extreme. Because if the problem was inside you, then the solution had to reach it. Even if reaching it caused discomfort. Even if it caused harm. The intention was always the same. Restore balance. Bring everything back to where it was supposed to be. But the idea of where it was supposed to be was not always clear. Because the perfect balance was more of an idea than a measurable state. Something imagined. Something described. But not something that could be precisely defined. Which meant that no matter how close you got, there was always room for adjustment. Always something that could be improved. Always a reason to intervene again. And again. And again. Balance was not a destination. It was a constant process. One that never fully ended. Because the body, according to this system, was never completely stable. It shifted with the seasons. It shifted with diet. It shifted with mood, with weather, with age. Everything influenced everything else. And when everything is connected like that, it becomes very easy to find reasons for change. A slightly colder morning. A slightly heavier meal. A slightly longer moment of silence. All of it could be interpreted. All of it could be adjusted. And slowly, over time, life became a series of small corrections. Small decisions made to maintain balance. To avoid excess. To avoid deficiency. To avoid becoming something that required more serious intervention. Because serious intervention was something people understood. They had seen it. They had experienced it. And they knew it was not something to invite. So they stayed within the boundaries. Carefully. Quietly. Maintaining a kind of steady existence. That did not draw too much attention. That did not suggest imbalance. That did not invite correction. And in many ways, this created a form of self-regulation. Not based on understanding, but on caution. A constant awareness that something inside you could shift at any moment. That something small could become something larger. And that once it did, it might not be easy to reverse. So people adapted. They learned the patterns. They followed the guidance. They listened to those who claimed to understand the system. Even when the results were uncertain. Because uncertainty was everywhere. But structure made it feel manageable. Now, over time, something interesting began to happen. Small inconsistencies appeared. Moments where the explanation did not quite match the outcome. Treatments that worked for one person did nothing for another. Symptoms that should have followed a pattern did not. People who were expected to recover did not. And people who should not have recovered sometimes did. At first, these were just exceptions. Unusual cases. Outliers. Things that could be explained away without changing the system. But as time passed, those exceptions became harder to ignore. Not obvious. Not overwhelming, but present. A quiet accumulation of things that did not quite fit. And when enough of those moments gather, even the most stable systems begin to feel slightly uncertain. Not enough to collapse. Not enough to disappear. But enough to create small cracks. Small spaces where new ideas might eventually form. But that change was still far away. For now, the system remained steady, familiar, confident, continuing to explain the human body as a balance of fluids, a container of shifting elements, a structure that could be corrected through careful intervention, even when the correction was not what the body needed, even when the explanation was not what the body truly was, even when the explanation was not what the body truly was. Because for a long time, there was no alternative, no competing system, no widely accepted way to describe the body differently. Only small observations, quiet doubts, moments where something felt slightly off. Not enough to reject the system, but enough to notice. And noticing, as always, was the beginning of something. Slowly, people began to see patterns that did not quite match the theory. A person could be treated exactly as expected and still not improve. Another could ignore the advice completely and somehow recover anyway. Two people with similar symptoms could respond in completely different ways. And these differences were difficult to explain within a system that relied on balance alone. Because if everything comes down to fluids, then similar imbalances should lead to similar outcomes. But they did not. And that inconsistency created a quiet tension. Not loud enough to disrupt everything. Not strong enough to replace what already existed. But present. Persistent. A small, steady pressure against certainty. Now, this did not immediately lead to change. Systems like this do not disappear quickly. They adapt. They adjust. They absorb contradictions and reshape them until they still appear consistent. A failed treatment did not disprove the theory. It simply meant the treatment had not been applied correctly, or that the imbalance had been misunderstood, or that the patient was too far from balance to recover. There was always an explanation. There was always a way to preserve the system. Because preserving the system meant preserving certainty. And certainty was still more valuable than accuracy. But over time, something subtle began to shift. The focus moved, slowly, from explanation to observation. Not completely. Not all at once. But enough to matter. Instead of asking only, what should be happening? Some began to ask, what was actually happening? They paid closer attention to outcomes, to differences, to the details that did not fit neatly into the existing framework. And in doing so, they started to see the body not just as a theory, but as something real, something complex, something that did not always follow simple rules. Now, this shift was not dramatic. It did not overturn medieval physiology overnight. It did not replace the humors with a new, perfect understanding. It simply introduced a new kind of question. A quieter one. A more careful one. Not, what does the system say this is? But, what is actually happening here? And that question Simple as it seems. Changed everything. Because once you begin to ask, what is actually happening? You open the door to uncertainty again. And uncertainty, while uncomfortable, is also where new understanding begins. But that process is slow. It does not rush. It does not announce itself. It builds gradually. Observation by observation. Experience by experience. Until eventually, the old explanations start to feel less complete. Not entirely wrong, but no longer sufficient. And when that happens, people begin to look for something more. Something that explains. Not just most things, but all the things that did not quite fit before. Now, during this time, most people continued as they always had. They followed the familiar rules. They trusted the established ideas. They lived within the structure that had always been there. Because changing the way you understand your body is not simple. It is not immediate. It requires letting go of something that once made sense. And that is never easy. So the system remained. But alongside it, something new was forming. Not a replacement yet. Not a complete alternative. Just a different way of looking. A way that relied a little less on assumption, and a little more on observation. And over time, that difference would grow. Slowly. Quietly. Until it became impossible to ignore. Every small detail becomes relevant. Every action becomes evidence. You begin to reconstruct the previous day, not as a memory, but as a sequence of possible mistakes. Something you ate. Something you did. Something you thought. Somewhere in that sequence, the balance shifted. And now your body is telling you. Not clearly. Not directly. But through feeling. A heaviness that should not be there. A quiet resistance to movement. A subtle sense that something is not quite right. And that feeling cannot be ignored. Because ignoring it would mean allowing the imbalance to grow. An imbalance, if left alone, does not stay small. It spreads. It deepens. It becomes something that requires intervention. So you act early. You adjust. Perhaps you eat differently. Something warmer. Something lighter. Something that might gently encourage your body back toward balance. You move a little more. Or a little less. You try to correct without force. Because force comes later. Force is for when things have already gone too far. But as the day continues, the feeling does not disappear. It lingers. Not intense enough to stop you. But present enough to remain in your awareness. A quiet reminder that something inside you is still unsettled. And at that point, the question becomes more serious. Not whether something is wrong. But how wrong it is. Because there are degrees to imbalance. Small shifts that can be corrected with routine. And larger ones that require intervention. And the line between the two is not always clear. So you observe. You pay attention to your body in a way that is both careful and slightly tense. You notice your breathing. Your posture. The way your thoughts move. You become aware of yourself in fragments. Not as a whole person. But as a system of parts that may or may not be working correctly. And that awareness changes the way you exist. Because instead of simply feeling something, you are constantly interpreting it. Every sensation becomes a question. Every thought becomes a signal. Every moment becomes something to evaluate. And over time, that evaluation becomes automatic. You do not choose to analyze. You simply do. Because you have been taught that this is how the body works. That this is how problems are found. And more importantly, how they are prevented. But there is a quiet cost to that way of living. A cost that is not immediately obvious. Because constant self-observation does not always lead to clarity. Sometimes it leads to doubt. Because the more you look for imbalance, the more likely you are to find it. Even when it is not there. A normal feeling can begin to seem unusual. A small discomfort can begin to feel significant. And once that process starts, it becomes difficult to stop. Because now you are not just responding to your body. You are anticipating it. Watching for signs that something might go wrong. Preparing for imbalance before it fully arrives. And that anticipation creates its own kind of tension. A quiet, steady alertness. Not panic. Not fear. But a low, constant awareness that something inside you could shift at any moment. And that awareness changes how you move through the world. You become more careful. More measured. Less willing to push yourself too far in any direction. Because extremes are dangerous. Too much activity. Too much rest. Too much emotion. Too much thought. Everything must be kept within limits. Everything must remain controlled. And control, in this case, is not about mastery. It is about avoidance. Avoiding imbalance. Avoiding symptoms. Avoiding the need for stronger correction. Because once stronger correction begins, the experience changes. It becomes more direct. More physical. More difficult to ignore. A physician may be consulted. Observations will be made. Questions will be asked. Not about your life. But about your body. How often you sleep. How often you eat. How often you sigh. How often you feel something that cannot be easily explained. And from those answers, a conclusion will be formed. Not slowly. Not uncertainly. But with confidence. Because the system already knows what it is looking for. An imbalance. A disruption. A shift in the humors that must be corrected. And once that conclusion is reached, the next step is clear. Action. Not reflection. Not discussion. Action. Something must be done to restore what has been lost. And that action is rarely comfortable. Because comfort is not the goal. Correction is. The body must be adjusted. Forced, if necessary, back into alignment. And whether that adjustment works or not, it reinforces the system. Because something has been done. Something has been attempted. Something has taken place that transforms uncertainty into effort. And effort, even when it fails, feels meaningful. It feels like progress. It feels like control. And control, once again, is the center of everything. Not understanding. Not truth. Control. The sense that the body can be managed. That its problems can be addressed. That its discomforts are not random, but structured. Even when that structure is imagined. Even when the explanation does not match reality. Because the alternative is far more difficult. The alternative is accepting that the body is complex. That it does not always behave in predictable ways. That sometimes it changes without a clear reason. And that not every feeling has a simple cause. That kind of uncertainty is hard to live with. So the system remains. It continues to offer answers. It continues to provide explanations. It continues to turn every sensation into something that can be named, categorized, and corrected. And for a long time, that is enough. Not because it is accurate. But because it is consistent. And consistency creates trust. Even when it should not. Even when it should not. Because trust does not always come from truth. Sometimes it comes from repetition. From hearing the same explanation again and again until it becomes familiar. Until it feels stable. Until it feels like the only possible way to understand what is happening. And once that happens, the system no longer feels like a theory. It feels like reality. A fixed structure that exists beneath everything else. Something you do not question because there is nothing to compare it to. And inside that structure, every experience finds its place. Every discomfort has a reason. Every change has a cause. Every sensation points back to something inside you that needs attention. And slowly, over time, this creates a particular kind of mindset. One that is always slightly inward. Always observing. Always adjusting. You begin to see yourself not just as a person living in the world, but as a system that must be maintained. A balance that must be preserved. And that perspective changes how you relate to everything. Food becomes strategy. Rest becomes calculation. Emotion becomes evidence. Nothing is simple anymore. Not because life has become more complicated, but because the way you interpret it has. A quiet moment is no longer just quiet. It becomes an opportunity to notice something. A shift in mood. A change in energy. A small signal that might indicate imbalance. And once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. It stays with you. It becomes part of your awareness. And that awareness, over time, becomes constant. Not overwhelming. Not intense. But always present. Like a background process that never fully stops. Monitoring. Evaluating. Interpreting. And because of that, even ordinary experiences begin to feel slightly different. Eating is not just eating. It is an interaction with your internal state. Sleeping is not just resting. It is a process that must be done correctly. Thinking is not just thinking. It is something that must be controlled. Limited. Kept within safe boundaries. Because too much thinking leads to heat. Heat leads to dryness. Dryness leads to instability. And instability leads to consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. So you learn to stay within limits. Not extreme limits. Not restrictive in an obvious way. But present enough to guide your behavior. You stop yourself before going too far. You adjust before something becomes noticeable. You correct small things before they have the chance to grow. And in doing so, you create a kind of steady existence. Predictable. Controlled. Carefully maintained. But never entirely relaxed. Because relaxation would mean letting go of control. And letting go of control would mean allowing imbalance to develop without resistance. Which is not something the system encourages. So even rest becomes intentional. Even stillness is observed. You lie down, but you remain aware. You close your eyes, but you continue to notice. Your breathing. Your thoughts. The subtle movements of your mind as it shifts from one idea to another. And if those thoughts become too active, too vivid, too engaging, you recognize it as a potential problem. Because even in rest, the mind is expected to behave. To remain quiet. To remain passive. To avoid creating excess activity that might disturb the balance. And if it does not, if the mind continues to move, to imagine, to create, then that becomes something to consider. Something to correct. Even dreams are not entirely safe. A dream that is too vivid suggests that the mind has not settled. That something is still active when it should be still. And that activity, once again, points back to imbalance. Always back to imbalance. The explanation does not change. Only the details do. And because the explanation remains the same, it continues to feel reliable. Even when the details vary. Even when the outcomes are unpredictable. Because unpredictability is absorbed into the system. It is explained as complexity. As variation within the same basic structure. Not as a flaw in the structure itself. And this is how the system sustains itself. Not by being correct. But by being adaptable. flexible enough to include contradictions, stable enough to remain unchanged. And as long as that balance exists, the system continues. It guides decisions. It shapes behavior. It defines what is normal and what is not. And most importantly, it defines what needs to be corrected. Because once something is labeled as imbalance, it immediately becomes a problem. Something that requires attention. Something that cannot simply be left alone. And that constant need for correction creates a particular rhythm to life. A cycle. Observation. Interpretation. Adjustment. And then back again. Always moving. Always refining. Always attempting to reach a state that is never fully achieved. A perfect balance that exists more as an idea than a reality. And yet, it is pursued. Carefully. Consistently. Because the idea itself is powerful. The idea that everything inside you can be aligned. That every discomfort has a solution. That every imbalance can be corrected if you respond in the right way. That idea makes uncertainty feel smaller. It gives shape to something that would otherwise feel unpredictable. And even if the shape is not accurate, it is still something. Something to hold on to. Something to follow. Something that turns the unknown into a process. And for a long time, that process is enough. A steady attempt to maintain order within something that is far more complex than it appears. Because beneath all the structure, all the explanations, all the careful adjustments, the body continues to behave in ways that do not always follow the rules that have been given to it. It changes. Quietly. Constantly. Without asking permission. Without waiting to be understood. And those changes are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are so small that they are barely noticed at first. A slight difference in energy. A subtle shift in mood. A moment where something feels unfamiliar for reasons that are not immediately clear. And in a system built on interpretation, even the smallest change becomes significant. Because significance is not determined by intensity. It is determined by meaning. And meaning, in this case, is always connected to balance. So even a small change invites attention. A moment of pause. A brief internal check. Something is different. Something may need to be adjusted. And this constant attention creates a particular rhythm of awareness. Not overwhelming. Not urgent. But continuous. A low, steady observation that follows you through the day. You move, and it moves with you. You think, and it quietly evaluates. You rest, and it remains present. Always there. Always watching. Always ready to interpret. And because of that, even stillness is not entirely still. There is always a layer of awareness beneath it. A sense that something could shift. That something could change. That something inside you is always in motion, even when everything appears calm. And this awareness, over time, becomes familiar. Not uncomfortable. Not intrusive. Just part of how you exist. A background presence that shapes your choices without needing to be acknowledged. You eat with it. You sleep with it. You think with it. It becomes part of the way you understand yourself. Not as a fixed person. But as a changing balance. A system that requires attention. A state that must be maintained. And in that way, the body is never truly at rest. Even when nothing is happening, something is always being considered. Something is always being measured against the idea of balance. And that idea, while simple, carries a certain weight. Because it suggests that perfection is possible. That there is a correct state. A precise alignment where everything works as it should. And once that idea takes hold, it becomes something to pursue. Not aggressively. Not obsessively. But consistently. A quiet effort to stay as close to that ideal as possible. To avoid drifting too far in any direction. To remain within the range that feels acceptable. And that effort shapes behavior in ways that are not always obvious. It encourages moderation, consistency, predictability. It discourages extremes, sudden changes, anything that might disrupt the balance that has been carefully maintained. And over time, this creates a kind of steady existence. Not rigid, but controlled. Not restrictive, but guided. A life lived within boundaries that are rarely questioned because they feel necessary. Because they are tied to the idea of health. To the belief that staying within those limits is what keeps everything functioning as it should. And for a while, that belief is enough. It provides direction. It offers reassurance. It gives people something to rely on in a world that is often uncertain. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift again. Not in the system itself, but in how it is experienced. The awareness that once felt helpful begins to feel slightly heavier. The constant observation becomes a little more noticeable. The need to interpret every feeling becomes a little more tiring. Not enough to reject it. Not enough to stop. But enough to feel. A quiet fatigue. A subtle sense that something about this process is not entirely comfortable. That constantly watching yourself, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to maintain balance, carries its own weight. And that weight, while manageable, is always present. Because the process never truly ends. There is no point where you can stop observing. No moment where you can say that everything is perfectly balanced and will remain that way. The system does not allow for that kind of certainty. It allows for temporary alignment. Brief moments where everything seems stable. But even those moments are understood as temporary. Because change is always expected. Imbalance is always possible. And that expectation keeps the process moving. Always returning. Always continuing. And in that continuous motion, something becomes clear. Not all at once. Not as a sudden realization. But as a gradual understanding. That the body is not as simple as the system suggests. That it does not always respond in predictable ways. That sometimes it changes without a clear cause. That sometimes it returns to balance on its own. Without intervention. Without correction. Without effort. And those moments, small as they are, begin to stand out. Because they do not fit neatly into the pattern. They suggest something different. Something that the system does not fully explain. And once that possibility appears, even briefly, it changes the way everything else is seen. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But quietly. In the background. Where small changes begin. And from those small changes, over time, something new will eventually emerge. A different way of understanding. A different way of observing. A different way of relating to the body. But that change is still distant. Still forming. Still incomplete. For now, the old system remains. Steady. Familiar. Continuing to guide, to explain, to interpret. Even as the first signs of something new begin to take shape beneath it. Even as the first signs of something new begin to take shape beneath it. Because change, when it comes, does not arrive all at once. It does not replace everything in a single moment. It begins quietly. Almost invisibly. Within the same routines. Within the same habits. Within the same structure that has always been there. At first, nothing looks different. People still observe themselves. They still interpret their feelings. They still adjust their behavior in small, careful ways. The language remains the same. Balance. Imbalance. Heat. Cold. Dryness. Moisture. The humors continue to explain what is happening. But underneath those explanations, something begins to shift. Not the words. but the attention behind them. A slightly longer pause before a conclusion. A slightly closer look at what actually happens. A quiet moment of noticing that does not immediately turn into interpretation. And that small difference matters. Because for the first time, the body is not only being explained. It is being observed. Not just through theory, but through experience. Through what actually unfolds, rather than what is expected to unfold. And that creates a subtle tension. A space between expectation and reality. A space where the two do not always align. At first, that space is easy to ignore. It is small. Occasional. Something that can be explained away. But it does not disappear. It remains. And over time, it grows. Not rapidly. Not dramatically. But steadily. Each time something does not behave as predicted, the space becomes slightly larger. Each time an outcome does not match the explanation, the certainty becomes slightly weaker. Not enough to collapse the system. Not enough to replace it. But enough to soften it. Enough to make it feel less absolute. And when a system stops feeling absolute, it becomes easier to question. Not openly. Not directly. But quietly. Carefully. In ways that do not draw attention. Because questioning something that has always been accepted is not simple. It requires a shift not only in knowledge, but in perspective. A willingness to consider that what has always been true might not be complete. And that kind of shift takes time. It moves slowly. Through small observations. Through repeated experiences. Through moments that cannot be fully explained within the existing framework. And as those moments accumulate, they begin to form patterns. New patterns. Patterns that do not rely entirely on the old explanations. Patterns that suggest the body might operate in ways that are more complex, more variable, more independent than previously believed. And once those patterns begin to take shape, they open the door to something new. Not certainty. But curiosity. A different kind of curiosity. Not the kind that is discouraged. Not the kind that is seen as dangerous. But a quieter form. A careful interest in what is actually happening. An attention that is not immediately followed by correction. But by observation. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes everything. Because once you begin to observe without immediately trying to fix, you start to see more. You notice details that were previously overlooked. You recognize variations that were previously ignored. You begin to understand that the body does not always need intervention. That sometimes it adjusts on its own. That sometimes it moves toward balance without being forced. And those realizations, small as they are, begin to reshape the way the body is understood. Not as something that must constantly be corrected. But as something that has its own processes. Its own rhythms. Its own ways of responding to change. And that idea, once it begins to form, is difficult to reverse. Because it introduces a new possibility. That the body is not just a passive system waiting to be adjusted. But an active one. Capable of responding. Capable of adapting. Capable of maintaining itself in ways that are not always visible, not always predictable, but real. And once that possibility is considered, even briefly, it changes the role of the observer. From someone who must constantly intervene. To someone who can sometimes step back. Sometimes wait. Sometimes allow things to unfold without immediate correction. And that shift, while small, is significant. Because it reduces the need for constant action. It softens the urgency. It introduces the idea that not every imbalance requires immediate response. That some things can be observed before they are changed. And in that space between observation and action, something new begins to develop. Understanding. Not complete. Not perfect. But growing. Built not only on explanation, but on experience. on what actually happens, rather than what is expected to happen. And that kind of understanding takes time. It requires patience, attention, a willingness to remain in uncertainty a little longer than before. But as it develops, it begins to replace something. Not all at once. Not completely. But gradually. The old certainty begins to fade. Not disappearing. But becoming less dominant. Less absolute. More open to question. More flexible. More willing to adapt. And as that happens, the entire system begins to change. Slowly. Quietly. From within. From within. Because systems rarely disappear from the outside. They do not simply stop. They do not suddenly collapse. They change gradually, as the way people experience them begins to shift. And that shift is not always obvious. At first, it feels like nothing more than a slightly different way of paying attention. A moment where you notice something, but do not immediately label it. A feeling that you allow to exist without rushing to correct it. A small pause between observation and action. And in that pause, something new begins to form. Not a new theory. Not a replacement. Just a different relationship with the body. One that is a little less immediate. A little less reactive. A little more patient. And patience, in this context, is something that had been missing. Because the earlier system did not encourage waiting. It encouraged action. Immediate, confident action based on established explanations. But now, slowly, that urgency begins to soften. Not disappearing entirely. But becoming less automatic. Less certain. Because once you see that not every imbalance requires correction, it becomes harder to justify constant intervention. You begin to notice that some feelings pass on their own. That some discomfort fades without being addressed. That the body, at times, moves back toward stability without assistance. And those moments are important. Because they suggest something different. They suggest that the body is not only something that needs to be managed, but something that can manage itself. And that idea, once it takes hold, changes everything. Not quickly. Not completely. But steadily. It reduces the sense of urgency. It creates space for observation. It allows for the possibility that doing nothing, at least for a while, might be part of the process. And that possibility is unfamiliar. Because it goes against everything the system has taught. It challenges the idea that every imbalance must be corrected immediately. It introduces uncertainty again. But this time, the uncertainty feels different. Less threatening. Less overwhelming. Because it is balanced by experience. By the quiet realization that not every unanswered question leads to a problem. That not every unexplained feeling needs to be resolved right away. And in that realization, a new kind of confidence begins to form. Not the confidence of having all the answers. But the confidence of being able to exist without them. To observe without immediately concluding. To feel without immediately correcting. To allow the body to move through its own processes without constant interference. And that kind of confidence is quieter. Less rigid. More flexible. It does not rely on certainty. It allows for variation. For complexity. For the possibility that the body is not always predictable. And as this perspective develops, it begins to influence everything. How people respond to discomfort. How they interpret changes. How they decide when to act and when to wait. The body becomes less of a problem to solve and more of something to understand. Not fully. Not completely. But gradually. Through attention. Through experience. Through time. And that shift, while subtle, marks the beginning of something important. A movement away from rigid explanation. Towards something more open. More responsive. More aligned with what is actually happening, rather than what is expected to happen. But this movement is slow. It does not erase what came before. The old ideas remain. They continue to exist alongside the new observations. They still influence behavior. Still shape understanding. Because once a system has been established, it does not disappear easily. It lingers. It adapts. It coexists with newer ways of thinking. And for a long time, both perspectives remain. One based on certainty and structure. The other based on observation and experience. Sometimes they align. Sometimes they conflict. And in that tension, something new continues to develop. A deeper understanding. Not perfect. Not complete. But evolving. Shaped by both what has been believed and what has been observed. And over time, that understanding begins to take precedence. Not because it is forced. But because it fits more closely with reality. It explains more. It adapts more easily. It allows for differences rather than trying to eliminate them. And as it grows, it gradually reshapes the way the body is understood. From something that must be constantly corrected. To something that can often correct itself. From something fragile and easily disrupted. To something more resilient. More capable. Sometimes, what feels like imbalance is simply variation. A natural shift. A temporary state that does not need to be fixed. And recognizing that difference reduces the need for constant correction. It softens the relationship with the body. It removes some of the tension that comes from always trying to maintain perfect balance. Because perfect balance, as it turns out, is not something that can be permanently achieved. It is something that moves. Something that adjusts. Something that changes in response to countless factors, many of which are not immediately visible. And once that is understood, even in a small way, the idea of control begins to change. It becomes less about forcing the body into a specific state. And more about responding to it. Listening to it. Allowing it to move through its own processes while offering support when needed. And that approach is different. Quieter. Less aggressive. More patient. It does not rush to correct. It does not assume that every discomfort is a failure of balance. It allows for the possibility that the body is doing something necessary, even if it is not immediately understood. And that possibility changes the way discomfort is experienced. It becomes less threatening. Less urgent. Something that can be observed rather than immediately resisted. And in that shift, the relationship between the person and the body begins to change. From opposition. To cooperation. From control. To understanding. From constant adjustment. To careful attention. And that change, while subtle, is significant. Because it reduces the distance between experience and interpretation. It allows the body to be experienced more directly, without being immediately filtered through a rigid system of explanation. And that direct experience reveals something important. That the body is not just a passive object. It is active. Responsive. Constantly adapting to internal and external conditions. Often in ways that are not obvious, not immediate. But effective over time. And seeing that requires patience. It requires staying with an experience long enough to notice how it changes. How it develops. How it resolves. Without immediately stepping in to alter it. And that patience, once developed, becomes a new kind of skill. A way of engaging with the body that is less about control and more about awareness. Less about fixing and more about understanding. And over time, that skill begins to replace the older habits. Not entirely. Not all at once. But gradually. The impulse to immediately correct becomes less strong. The need to explain everything through a fixed system becomes less necessary. And in its place, a different approach begins to take shape. One that is more flexible. More adaptable. more aligned with the reality of how the body actually behaves. And as this approach develops, it brings with it a different kind of stability. Not the stability of perfect balance, but the stability of being able to respond to change, to adjust when needed, to observe when action is not required, to move with the body rather than constantly trying to force it into a specific state. And that kind of stability is more resilient, because it does not depend on maintaining a single ideal condition. It depends on the ability to adapt, to shift, to respond. And that makes it stronger, more sustainable, more reflective of the body itself, which is never static, never fixed, always moving, always changing, always finding its way through a complex and shifting environment. And understanding that changes everything. Not quickly, not completely, but deeply. Because it transforms the way the body is seen. Not as something fragile that must be constantly controlled, but as something capable. Something that can handle more than it was previously given credit for. Something that does not need to be corrected at every moment, but understood over time. And once that understanding begins to take hold, the old system continues to fade. Not disappearing entirely, but becoming less central, less dominant, more like a shadow of what it once was. Still present, still recognizable, but no longer the only way to see. And in that space, something new continues to grow. A different perspective. A quieter one. Less certain, but more accurate. Less rigid, but more real. And it continues to develop. One observation at a time. One experience at a time. Moving forward, slowly, into a deeper understanding of something that was never as simple as it once seemed. Moving forward, slowly, into a deeper understanding of something that was never as simple as it once seemed. Because simplicity, while comforting, rarely captures the full picture. It reduces complexity into something manageable. Something easy to follow. Something that feels complete, even when it leaves things out. And for a long time, that simplicity shaped everything. It defined how the body was understood. How discomfort was interpreted. How change was explained. But as observation deepens, simplicity begins to feel limited. Not entirely wrong, but incomplete. A framework that explains some things clearly, but struggles with others. And those struggles become more noticeable over time. Not because they suddenly appear, but because attention has shifted. Where once there was immediate explanation, there is now a moment of pause. Where once there was certainty, there is now a small space for doubt. And that space, while subtle, changes how everything is experienced. A sensation is no longer immediately categorized. It is felt first. Not analyzed. Not corrected. Just experienced. And that experience reveals something important. That sensations are not always fixed. They move. They change. They evolve over time. A feeling that begins one way can shift into something else entirely. A discomfort can rise, peak, and then fade without intervention. An emotion can appear strongly and then soften on its own. And noticing that movement creates a different kind of understanding. One that is based not on static definitions, but on process. On change. On the idea that what is happening now is not necessarily what will continue to happen. And that idea reduces urgency. It makes immediate correction less necessary. Because if something is already changing, it may not need to be forced. It may only need to be observed. And that observation, when allowed to continue, begins to reveal patterns. Not rigid patterns. Not predictable in every detail. But consistent enough to be recognized. The body responds. It adjusts. It moves toward balance in its own way. Not always quickly. Not always smoothly, but often without external intervention. And that realization changes the role of action. Action is no longer the default response. It becomes one option among many. Something to be used when needed, not something that must happen immediately. And that shift creates a different rhythm. A slower one. More deliberate. More attentive. Less reactive. It allows for the possibility that waiting is not neglect. That observing is not inaction. That sometimes the most appropriate response is simply to remain present and allow the process to unfold. And in that presence, something else begins to develop. A deeper familiarity with the body. Not as a concept. Not as a system of humors. But as something lived. Something experienced directly, without the need for constant interpretation. And that familiarity builds trust. Not the kind of trust that comes from certainty. But the kind that comes from experience. From seeing, again and again, that the body is capable of adjusting. Of responding. Of moving through states without always needing to be corrected. And that trust softens the relationship. It reduces the need for constant control. It allows for a more flexible way of engaging with change. A way that is not driven by fear of imbalance, but by understanding of variation. Because variation is not the same as dysfunction. Difference is not the same as disorder. And once that distinction becomes clear, it changes everything. It removes some of the pressure to maintain a perfect state. It allows for movement. For fluctuation. For the natural shifts that occur over time. And in that allowance, the experience of the body becomes less rigid. Less constrained. More fluid in a different sense. Not fluid as in humors. But fluid as in change. Continuous. Unfixed. Responsive. And that responsiveness becomes the focus. Not the idea of maintaining a single correct balance. But the ability to move between states. To adapt. To respond to what is happening rather than trying to force everything into a predefined structure. And that approach, while quieter, is more aligned with reality. Because the body is not static. It is dynamic. Always interacting with the environment. With food. With rest. With thought. With time. All of these factors influence it. Not in simple, predictable ways. But in complex, interconnected patterns. And understanding those patterns requires patience. It requires attention that is sustained over time. It requires a willingness to remain with uncertainty long enough for clarity to emerge. And that is not something that happens quickly. It develops slowly. Through repeated experience. Through observation that is not rushed. Through a gradual shift away from immediate explanation and toward deeper awareness. And as that awareness grows, it begins to replace the older need for constant correction. Not completely. But significantly. The impulse to act becomes more measured. More intentional. Less automatic. And in that change, something important is gained. A sense of balance that is not forced. A stability that is not rigid. A way of existing that is not built on constant adjustment, but on continuous understanding. And that understanding continues to grow. Not reaching a final point. Not becoming complete. But expanding. Deepening. Becoming more accurate over time. As more is observed. As more is experienced. As the body reveals itself not as a simple system to be controlled, but as something far more intricate. Far more capable. Far more alive than it was once believed to be. And with that realization, the old certainty fades further. Not disappearing entirely. But becoming something that belongs to the past. A way of thinking that once provided structure, but no longer defines the present. And in its place, something quieter continues to unfold. Something built not on fixed answers, but on ongoing discovery. A process that does not end. A way of understanding that continues to evolve, just as the body itself continues to change. A process that does not end. A way of understanding that continues to evolve, just as the body itself continues to change. Because change is not something that happens occasionally. It is constant. It is the quiet background of everything. Every moment carries a small shift. A slight adjustment. A movement from one state to another. Often unnoticed. Often unrecognized. But always present. And once attention begins to settle into that reality, the idea of a fixed balance starts to feel less convincing. Not wrong. But incomplete. Because balance, as it turns out, is not something that stays still. It is something that moves. Something that responds. Something that is created again and again through interaction. Between the body and its surroundings. Between internal processes and external conditions. Between rest and activity. Between thought and stillness. And in that movement, there is no final point. No perfect state that can be reached and held indefinitely. Only continuous adjustment. Continuous response. Continuous change. And understanding that changes how effort is applied. It shifts effort away from trying to maintain a single condition. Towards something more flexible. More adaptive. More aligned with the nature of the body itself. Effort becomes less about control and more about attention. Less about forcing outcomes and more about noticing patterns. Less about reacting immediately and more about responding appropriately. And that distinction, small as it seems, has a profound effect. Because reacting is immediate. Automatic. Driven by the need to fix something as quickly as possible. Responding, on the other hand, requires space. It requires observation. It requires time to understand what is actually happening before deciding what to do. And that space changes everything. It allows for clarity. For a more accurate sense of what is needed and what is not. For the recognition that not every change is a problem. Not every discomfort is a signal of something going wrong. Sometimes it is simply part of the process. Part of the way the body moves through different states. And allowing for that possibility reduces unnecessary action. It prevents the cycle of constant correction. It creates a more stable relationship with change itself. One that is less driven by urgency and more guided by understanding. And over time, that relationship becomes familiar. It becomes the new way of engaging with the body. Not through rigid rules. Not through fixed explanations. But through direct experience. Through attention that is sustained rather than rushed. Through a willingness to remain present with what is happening rather than immediately trying to alter it. And that presence reveals something important. That the body is not separate from experience. It is experience. Every sensation, every feeling, every shift in energy is part of a continuous process. A process that cannot be fully captured by simple categories. A process that is always unfolding. Always changing. And once that is recognized, even in a small way, it becomes easier to let go of the need for constant explanation. Not completely. Not all at once. But gradually. The need to define every sensation begins to fade. The impulse to categorize every feeling becomes less strong. And in that reduction, something else emerges. A quieter awareness. One that does not need to label everything in order to understand it. One that can remain with experience as it is, without immediately turning it into a problem or a solution. And that awareness is different. It is less structured. Less certain. But more accurate. Because it reflects the complexity of what is actually happening rather than reducing it to something simpler. And that accuracy, while less comforting than certainty, is more useful. It allows for better responses. More appropriate actions. A deeper understanding of what the body needs and what it does not. And over time, that understanding becomes its own kind of stability. Not the stability of fixed balance, but the stability of being able to adapt, to respond, to move with change rather than against it. And that kind of stability is resilient, because it does not depend on maintaining a single state. It depends on the ability to navigate between states, to adjust as conditions change, to remain steady even when the body itself is shifting. And that resilience changes how discomfort is experienced. It becomes less threatening, less urgent, something that can be explored rather than immediately resisted, something that can be understood rather than instantly corrected. And in that shift, the relationship between the person and the body continues to evolve. From something that must be controlled, to something that can be trusted. Not completely, not blindly, but enough to allow for space, for observation, for the possibility that the body is not always working against you, but often working in ways that are simply not immediately understood. And that possibility, once accepted, changes everything. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but deeply. Because it removes the constant tension of needing to manage every moment. It allows for a more natural flow. A way of existing that is less constrained by rigid expectations and more open to what is actually happening. And that openness creates a different kind of clarity. One that is not based on having all the answers, but on being able to see what is there. To notice. To respond. To adapt. And that clarity continues to grow. Not reaching an end point. Not becoming complete. But expanding with each experience. Each observation. Each moment of attention. And through that process, the understanding of the body continues to deepen. Moving further away from simple explanations. Further away from rigid systems. Towards something more nuanced. More accurate. More reflective of the complexity that was always there. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be understood. Waiting to be noticed. Waiting to be understood. Because for a long time, understanding was not about seeing what was there. It was about fitting what was there into something already known. A structure that existed before the observation. A system that shaped the meaning of every experience before it was even fully felt. And that approach, while effective in creating consistency, left little room for discovery. It explained quickly. Confidently. Without hesitation. But it did not always listen. It did not always allow the experience itself to speak. It translated everything immediately into familiar terms. Balance. Imbalance. Heat. Cold. Dryness. Moisture. The same language applied to every situation. The same conclusions reached again and again. And because of that, something was missed. Not entirely. Not completely. But enough to matter. The finer details. The subtle differences. The variations that did not fit neatly into the existing categories. And those details, once attention begins to settle on them, reveal something important. That no two experiences are exactly the same. That even similar feelings can unfold in different ways. That the body does not repeat itself perfectly. It varies. It adapts. It responds to countless factors that are not always visible, not always measurable, but always present. And recognizing that requires a different kind of attention. Not one that rushes to categorize, but one that remains with the experience long enough to notice how it changes. How it moves. How it develops over time. And that kind of attention is slower. More patient. More open. It does not seek immediate answers. It allows understanding to emerge gradually. Through observation. Through repeated experience. Through a willingness to stay with uncertainty until something becomes clear. And that clarity, when it arrives, is different from certainty. It is not rigid. It does not claim to explain everything. It simply reflects what has been seen, what has been experienced, what has been observed over time. And that makes it more flexible, more adaptable, more aligned with the nature of the body itself. Because the body is not fixed. It does not operate according to a single, unchanging rule. It responds. It adjusts. It shifts in ways that are sometimes predictable and sometimes not. An understanding that requires letting go of the idea that everything can be fully controlled. That every outcome can be directed. That every imbalance can be corrected immediately. Instead, it requires a different approach. One that accepts variation. That allows for uncertainty. That recognizes that not everything needs to be resolved right away. And in that acceptance, something else begins to change. The way discomfort is perceived. It becomes less of an immediate problem. Less of a signal that something must be fixed. And more of an experience that can be explored. Something that can be observed. Something that can be understood in its own time. And that shift reduces pressure. It softens the constant need to act. It creates space for the body to move through its own processes without interference. And in that space, something becomes visible. The natural tendency of the body to adjust. To respond. To move towards stability even without external correction. And that tendency, once recognized, builds trust. Not absolute trust. Not the kind that removes all doubt. But enough to change how action is approached. Enough to allow for moments of waiting. Moments of observation. Moments where nothing is done, and yet something is still happening. And those moments are important. Because they reveal that action is not always necessary for change to occur. That sometimes the most effective response is to allow the process to unfold. To remain present without interfering. To watch as the body moves through its own patterns. And over time, those patterns become more familiar. Not predictable in every detail. But recognizable. You begin to see how certain states rise and fall. How certain sensations change over time. How certain experiences resolve without direct intervention. And that familiarity creates a different kind of confidence. One that is not based on controlling outcomes. But on understanding processes. On recognizing that the body has its own ways of finding balance. Its own ways of responding to change. And that understanding changes the relationship entirely. From one of constant management. To one of attentive awareness. From one of immediate correction. To one of thoughtful response. And that shift continues to develop. Not as a sudden transformation. But as a gradual reorientation. A movement away from rigid explanation. Toward direct experience. Toward a deeper, more nuanced understanding of something that cannot be reduced to simple terms. And as that understanding grows, it brings with it a sense of ease. Not because everything is fully understood. But because not everything needs to be. Because some things can simply be experienced. Observed. Allowed to move through their natural course. Without being forced into a predefined structure. And in that allowance, the body is no longer something to be constantly corrected. It becomes something to be lived with. Something to be experienced as it changes, as it responds, as it moves through different states over time. And that experience, while less certain, is more real. More connected to what is actually happening rather than what is expected to happen. And in that connection, something deeper begins to emerge. An understanding that is not imposed from the outside. But developed from within. Through attention. Through experience. Through time. And that understanding continues to grow. Quietly. Steadily. Without needing to announce itself. Without needing to replace everything that came before. It simply expands. It adds to what is already known. It refines. It adjusts. It deepens. Until eventually, the way the body is understood becomes something entirely different from where it began. Not defined by fluids. Not limited to balance. But recognized as something far more complex. Far more dynamic. Far more capable than it was once believed to be. Far more capable than it was once believed to be. And that realization does not arrive with noise. It does not announce itself as a turning point. It settles in quietly. Through repeated experience. Through moments where observation proves more reliable than assumption. Through small shifts in understanding that accumulate over time. And as those shifts gather, the body begins to feel different. Not because it has changed. But because the way it is perceived has changed. It is no longer something that must be constantly corrected. It is something that can be followed. Something that can be listened to. Something that can be understood through attention rather than force. And that difference, while subtle, transforms the experience completely. Because attention does not interrupt. It does not impose. It does not demand immediate results. It allows space. Space for change to happen naturally. Space for patterns to reveal themselves. Space for understanding to develop without pressure. And in that space, something becomes clearer. The body does not operate in isolation. It is connected to everything around it. To the environment. To the rhythm of the day. To the movement between activity and rest. To the quiet influence of time itself. And these connections shape its behavior in ways that are not always obvious. Not always immediate. But always present. A change in light. A shift in temperature. A difference in routine. All of these can influence how the body feels, how it responds, how it moves from one state to another. And recognizing that broadens the understanding. It moves beyond the idea that everything is happening inside. It introduces the possibility that the outside world plays a role as well. Not in simple, direct ways. But in subtle, interconnected patterns. And once that perspective begins to take shape, the body is no longer seen as a closed system. It becomes something more open. More responsive. More influenced by context than previously imagined. And that understanding adds depth. It explains variations that once seemed confusing. It provides a wider framework for interpreting change. It allows for complexity without immediately reducing it to something simple. And that is important. Because simplicity, while useful, can sometimes hide what is actually happening. It can smooth over details. It can remove nuance. It can create clarity at the cost of accuracy. And as understanding deepens, accuracy becomes more important than simplicity. Not because it provides certainty. But because it reflects reality more closely. And reality, in this case, is not simple. It is layered. It is dynamic. It is constantly shifting in response to countless influences. And recognizing that requires a different kind of awareness. One that is comfortable with complexity. One that does not need everything to be reduced to a single explanation. One that can hold multiple possibilities at once without needing to resolve them immediately. And that kind of awareness changes the experience of uncertainty. It makes it more manageable. Less something to avoid. More something to work with. Because uncertainty is no longer a gap that must be filled. It becomes a space where observation can take place. Where understanding can develop. Where new patterns can emerge over time. And in that space, something continues to evolve. A way of relating to the body that is less about control and more about connection. Less about fixing and more about noticing. Less about certainty and more about awareness. And that evolution is ongoing. It does not reach a final stage. It does not settle into a permanent conclusion. It continues to adapt as new experiences arise. As new observations are made. As the body continues to move through its endless process of change. And through all of this, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The body was never as simple as it once seemed. It was never just a balance of fluids. Never just a system to be adjusted through external correction. It was always something more. Something that required time to understand. Something that revealed itself gradually. Through experience rather than assumption. And now, as that understanding continues to deepen, the earlier explanations begin to feel distant. Not entirely wrong. But incomplete. A starting point rather than a conclusion. A way of making sense of something that had not yet been fully explored. And in that recognition, there is a certain quiet clarity. A sense that understanding is not something that is finished. It is something that continues. That grows. That changes as new insights emerge. And that process, while slower than certainty, is more aligned with reality. More reflective of how things actually unfold. And so it continues. Not as a fixed system. But as an ongoing exploration. A steady movement toward deeper awareness.